Ladies and gentlemen, I'm not going to bother to introduce Simon because everybody knows who he is, and you wouldn't be here unless you knew who he was. So I'm just going to kick off straight into the first. Is this mine? Yeah. So this is the book that we're concentrating on.
Can I just say other books are available?
Yes, that's right. Yeah,
this is very good
that'll
too.
Do it. That'll do it. Who was Chips Channon?
He was a self-hating American. It's probably the best way of describing it. He was born in Chicago in 1897. He was born into quite a rich family. His father was a great shipping magnate, and those, as I would say, those of you with O-level geography will know that Chicago is not on an ocean. But he made his money from sending things around the Great Lakes, and they'd used some of their money before the war to do some philanthropy. Mrs. Channon, his mother, liked to help the third world, so she endowed a library in France. And, gosh, only here would you get a laugh for that.
And he hated his mother, didn't he? You come on to that at some stage.
Yeah, it was all very difficult. Well, she had the terrible problem of being American, as did his father, and she got him into the American Red Cross, stationed in Paris, hardship posting. He lived at the Ritz for 2 years, and this avoided him being a doughboy and being shot at by nasty Germans. And she used all her society contacts in the faubourg in Paris to see that he had a good time. And the first volume of the diary starts in 1918, and it's an almost Proustian account, and he knew Proust, again through his mother, of him with various duchesses and marquises and vicomtesses lording it around Paris, eating and drinking and having a good time. Then he comes to Oxford and does that 2-year soldier's degree, not that he was a soldier, after the war, and decides he wants to stay in England.
But why? Just because he hates America so much?
It's partly because he hates America. He is also, although history has cast him as a trivial and useless figure, he was incredibly well read and had a very good grasp of history. And he came to England and realized that England, like France, was a country of great age, culture, history, heritage, call it what you will. And of course it had a royal family, which France didn't have, so it was therefore greatly superior. And
he suffered from red carpet fever to the most extraordinary degree, didn't he?
Well, he could barely stand up, which is helpful if you want to be on your knees for most of the time, which I think he was. And he befriended at Oxford a man called Hubert Duggan, who was Curzon's stepson. And Duggan would take Chips back to Montacute for the weekend, and he'd meet Curzon. And Curzon, of course, at that stage, this is 1921-22, is the grandest man in England, in fact, probably the British Empire, and much grander than the king. And Chips decides to model himself on Curzon. And Curzon takes rather a shine to Chips, not in that sort of way, I hasten to add, but he just likes Chips, he finds him amusing. But Chips bases himself, the way he talks, the way he thinks, the way he acts, on Curzon, because he wants to be an English toff.
But he must have been amusing, because these diaries are amusing, aren't they? They have long and many very funny sections. So was he witty? Was he charming?
Yes, he'd escaped that American disease of the irony bypass. And of course, as he gets older, he's more subjected to amusing English people. He gets funnier and funnier. But that's not just the only reason why his diaries are so good. His diaries are also so good because he knows lots of interesting people, and he has a journalist's facility to go into any sort of gathering and find the most amusing person there and write in a very entertaining way with sharp powers of observation about that person and what he or she has said. And that's really why the diaries are so good, and why, because he meets so many people of note, that they are a very important historical document.
And despite being a homosexual, he marries very well, doesn't he? Tell us about that.
Well, you see, I wasn't there, as they say, but I'm still wondering how homosexual Chips was. I think he was predominantly homosexual, but I think also he did like women. And he meets, in the early 30s, Lady Honor Guinness, who's Lord Ivor's daughter. So her father's one of the richest men in the country, probably the richest man in Ireland at the time. And Chips is very lucky because not only does he marry into the aristocracy, but unlike many aristocrats at that time, it's a family that are absolutely loaded. so much so that his father-in-law buys him 5 Belgrave Square. I mean, a trivial little house with a ballroom big enough to have 400 people in it at a wedding reception. And a rather jolly small stately home in Essex, on halfway between London and Chips's constituency in Southend-on-Sea. And so he really has pulled the handle on the fruit machine of life, and 3 oranges have come up.
And what about, tell us about the constituency. He goes into politics not out of ideology, it struck me, but very much because it was socially quite a smart thing in those days to have the word MP after your name.
Yes, and of course he effectively inherited the seat. The seat had been held by Lord Iver, as he then wasn't, from 1910. He was Lord Elvedon. He then succeeded to the peerage and had to give the seat up in 1927. And his wife took over. And Lady Iver, I suppose it was eating all those whelks or something, got very bored with Southend. And when she acquired this son-in-law who had taken British citizenship on the day before he married her daughter, she had the ideal candidate to take over. And so it was given to Chips on a plate. Do you want to be an MP? Yes. Do you want to be MP for Southend? Well, if I have to. And so off he went to Southend. But actually, he really enjoyed it. And I mean, you and I both know how desultory many constituency MPs were about their duties in their constituency before the war and indeed after it for a time. And Chips is always done in Southend. He actually rather enjoys it. It's another world for him to observe. And it's also a world that he can dive into and then just as easily get in his green Rolls Royce and dive out of and go back to Kelvedon or Belgrave.
And it stays in the family as well, doesn't it, that constituency?
Yes, his son Paul is selected by a fair and democratic process in 1959, after Chips has died, to succeed him and remains MP for nearly 40 years.
Let's talk about sex.
I don't think you're interested.
You've said that he's bisexual, but predominantly homosexual, in that he has a series of lovers until he meets Peter Coates. Then, when Peter Coates goes to India, he takes on Terence Rattigan, the playwright, as his lover, and then what happens after that? And also, do you try and get the 3 in a bed stuff in as well?
Well, when we launched the first volume of these in March last year, it was during lockdown, and we had to do it virtually. And we had a wonderful virtual launch from Haywood Hill in London, where Michael Gove and I spoke about Chips. And just before it ended, Nicky Dunn, the manager of Haywood Hill, came on and said, well, somebody who wants to ask a question, actually make a statement, is Lord Gage. Now, the present Lord Gage is the son of Lord Gage, who was a great friend of Chips, and they lived together in a bachelor flat in St James. And some of the reviewers and the serialisation had been skewed to give the impression that Chips and Gage had been lovers. And Lord Gage came on and said, I just want to say my father was not homosexual, end of statement. To which I replied, well, Lord Gage, I didn't say he was. Nowhere in the book does it say that. And but Chips is obviously very attracted to Gage. And when he's got married, which is in 1933...
He talks about Gage's breathing when in
Yes.
his bedroom at night.
Yeah. Oh, I think they do. I think there's a Laurel and Hardy film I remember where Laurel and Hardy get into bed together.
Yes.
And I don't think they make any babies or anything. Nothing happens.
No.
And I think this is what Chips used to do. I think he would cuddle up with Gage. He did the same with Alan Lennox Boyd. I'm not entirely sure what went on there.
Well, Alan Lennox Boyd was...
Well, he certainly, Alan Lennox Boyd was unquestionably of that persuasion. But
But with Laurel and Hardy, they didn't have any money and they had to share a room.
Right.
These guys were loaded and they didn't have to share a
no,
room.
I think Chips. I think Chips was pretending poverty at that moment. But when he's got married, they have Paul, and his wife says, "Right, I'm not doing that again," and she can't stand the sight of him for reasons that he never goes into, and of course she doesn't either. He then starts to suspect she's got a boyfriend, and she in fact runs through a couple of ski instructors and a Hungarian count, as one does. And he doesn't quite cotton on that something really bizarre is happening, even when she says in July 1938, I'm going skiing in Switzerland. But to be fair to honour, there is a picture of her and her sister in Switzerland in July 1938 with a patch of snow behind them about the size of that table. But anyway, Chips works out what's going on and gets very cross. And it's shortly after that that he meets Coates. And Coates is the first person that he unequivocally writes about in the diaries as being in love with. He doesn't say that about Gage in those terms. He doesn't say it about people like Jim Llewellyn, who was a Tory MP, of that persuasion, that he used to sit up at night talking to. That's what he says in the diaries. And this is where the mention of women, he no longer talks about going off to Shepherd Market to meet prostitutes.
Or Paris, what they were getting up to in Paris.
Well, and a particularly nasty event in Amsterdam in a brothel as well, but we shan't go into that, as there are ladies present.
But it's all in volume 1.
It's all in volume 1. And then he meets Coates 6 weeks before the war breaks out. And then Coates, who's a territorial officer, is immediately called up. He clears off abroad. He's then sent off to be Wavell's aide-de-camp. And then when Wavell becomes viceroy, he becomes his chief of staff. And he does come home during the war, and Chips loves him so much, he takes the enormous risk of going out all the way through Lisbon on a flying boat and down to the west coast of Africa and right across the Sahara Desert and up to Alexandria. It takes him 14 days to meet,
Which
to
year
see
are we
Coates.
talking about?
Late 1941, early 1942.
Yeah, so tremendously dangerous.
Tremendously dangerous time to go.
Yeah.
And then when we're nearly at the end of the war, he meets Terence Rattigan. And that is...
Whilst Coates is still in India.
Coates is still in India. And he and Rattigan, by the time Coates gets back from India in 1946, he and Terry, as he calls him, are like that. And he writes lavishly. As he gets older, he's less and less inhibited to write about what he's doing with these men.
Yeah.
And the Rattigan thing goes wrong, largely because Rattigan drinks so much. He's a very heavy drinker, and Chips gets very angry about that, although, you know, pot and kettle situation. And he's always got Lennox Boyd there. He's often going to bed with Lennox Boyd, and we never know whether that's just Laurel and Hardy or something a bit more serious. Lennox Boyd has a penchant for sailors, and when he's been through the Royal Navy, he starts with the Fleet Air Arm and then moves on to the Merchant Navy. So
it's an exciting day when the fleet's in town.
It's yes, in the Navy is always very exciting. But by the early 50s, when I think Chips feels that he's running out of rope, he's in bad health. He's in his early 50s, he has strokes. He keeps writing about his hemorrhages, which is pretty unpleasant. He's out, as they all were at the time, in Hyde Park picking up guardsmen.
And was he, whilst all this was going on, and there are some extraordinary scenes that he describes, he's also pursuing a serious political career, you're saying. Does he have, is he a trivial figure politically, or is there something significant to him?
He's pursuing a serious political career from 1935, when he goes into the House, until the summer of 1941, when Rab is moved from the Foreign Office. He's Rab Butler's PPS, and Rab's moved from the Foreign Office to become Minister of Education, where he designs the 1944 Education Act. And Chips loves being his PPS in the run-up to the war, because he has very close access to Neville Chamberlain. He has close access to his uncle, your own biographical subject, Lord Halifax, his uncle by marriage. And when it gets to 1941, he's more or less convinced Churchill's going to tell him to clear off because he was an appeaser. But he doesn't. And Rab says, look, if you want to come to the Ministry of Education with me and we'll stick together, then you're more than welcome. But I think the allure to Channon about working for Rab was he was on the diplomatic circuit. He was getting invited to grand embassy lunches and dinners. And I think the idea of several years of dinners and lunches with vice-chancellors and headmasters was not quite so appealing. Yeah. And so he says, no, I don't want to do it. He's also, I think, admitted to himself that if after 3 years as a PPS, Churchill's not prepared to recognise the excellence of his service and put him into the government, then he's not going to get into the government. And so he reverts to being a socialite.
And does he, would you say that his feelings for Churchill amount to hatred? Churchill gets the most terrible write-ups in this diary, doesn't he?
I think it's sort of ultra bitchiness rather than hatred.
Malice.
Malice, yeah. You know this as well as I do as a biographer of Churchill. What Chips thought about Churchill until 1939, even 1940, was what most people thought about Churchill in the 1930s. And they look back to the Dardanelles and the gold standard and the semi-naked fakir and all this sort of stuff that was said about Gandhi, and just thought he wasn't a serious person. And of course, most recently, he'd been on the wrong side in the abdication, as had Chips. And he thinks Churchill's a warmonger, and he very much admires Chamberlain. And he feels that Churchill's gone out of his way to undermine Chamberlain, and for which there's not very much evidence other than Churchill just exercising his constitutional right as a member of Parliament to point out things he thinks are wrong with government policy.
And you mentioned appeasement. He was when it comes to the panoply of appeasers, he's right on the sort of edge of pro-appeasement. Does he actually go over the edge into pro-Nazism?
He's certainly very sympathetic to the Nazis. I think there's a change of tone after Kristallnacht in 1938.
And yet he is an anti-Semite, of course.
Well, I wonder how genuine an anti-Semite he is. I don't think he's so anti-Semitic that he'd start herding people into ovens at Auschwitz.
No, but
I think he's sufficiently anti-Semitic that he sees it as a custom and a trope among the class to which he aspires, the class in which he hopes he's going to be recognised as belonging, to be rude about Jews. And he is very rude about Jews.
Tell us about the Buchenwald incident.
Oh yes, well there's this horrible business where in 1945 when Buchenwald has been liberated, he sees these terrible pictures of emaciated people and corpses and says that they remind him of Margot Asquith without her clothes on, which is a peculiarly horrible thing to say.
Truly terrible thing to say, but and which nobody but an anti-Semite could possibly write.
Well, I know, and I mean,
this is 1945,
yeah.
you know.
I was accused only last night by somebody of allowing this book to be censored, and that's an example of how we did not allow this book to be censored.
Nothing was censored.
There was a sexual incident that was censored.
Because the person's still alive?
No, just because it was so horrible that it was agreed that most people would be revolted by it.
Horrible... I'm sorry, obviously I've
I'll
got
tell
to
you
keep
private-
asking.
I'll tell you privately
that's
later.
sweet of you, I know, but
Well,
seriously, but that's
look.
really interesting. I mean, it's between two people who are dead, or maybe more people, or animals, or, you know, you name it. And and even now, half a century later, or however much later it is, you decided not to put it in the book.
I did.
Interesting.
And one day I'll tell you.
Okay. Actually, but let's talk about the massive self-censorship of the 1967 version of these diaries, a single volume by Robert Rhodes James, who was at that point was he
was Clerk of the House of Commons.
Clerk of the House of Commons, and a very he was MP for Cambridge actually when I was an undergraduate, and
Indeed.
he was he got a knighthood and so on, but he really behaved disgracefully over the original diaries, didn't he? He did something you or I wouldn't do.
No. I'm reluctant to criticise Robert because I think in his younger days he was a pretty good historian.
Yeah,
And you know, we both agree he did some good work. But he never saw, and apparently never asked to see, the original manuscript of the diaries. The original manuscript, I had photocopies of it in 70 blue folders, and there's a hell of a lot of it. It's 1.8 million words altogether, of which we published 1.4 million. And I was horrified to hear that he was given a version written by Peter Coates. I say written by Peter Coates. What Peter Coates did was he went through the diaries with the secretary and dictated, usually word for word, once or twice he corrected Chips's grammar, etc., a version that he wanted Rhodes James to work on. And if you look at the original manuscript, or indeed the photocopy, there are lines through paragraphs after paragraphs and pages after pages of things that, because they referred usually to homosexuality, to people who are still alive who are homosexual. Don't forget this was the early 1960s, it was still illegal. That was all taken out, and there were references to other people that were taken out because they were still alive, about how people treated their servants and how bad their food was and stuff like that, which I think Coates thought would be counterproductive. But I also saw, when I was doing this, the proof of Rhodes James's edition that Lady Honour had. And she had taken a lot of stuff out as well. And this was not because Chips or Coates or whoever had written this was being rude about her, because she just disappears. It's as if she was there one moment and gone the next. It's never explained to the reader of the Rose James edition what happened to Honor. But this was stuff largely about Churchill. And she's reading this in 1965-66. So Churchill is barely cold in his grave. And Chips is saying the things about him that you've just alluded to, that he's a mountebank and a charlatan and, you know, belligerent and a warmonger. And Honor said, I've taken out things which I think will damage Paul's political career. I don't want Paul to be associated with this. Yeah. So she was, I mean, mind you, having taken very little interest in her son until after Chips died. I mean, Chips was a brilliant father to him and went, you know, out of his way to be a great father, largely because Honor was off with, you know, first of all, a second-hand horse dealer from Ongar and then a Czech airman, you know.
It's, I mean, these are great diaries. How would you place them in the panoply of great diaries? It strikes me that two things that a lot of great diarists have is, first of all, and I'm thinking now in terms of Pepys and Boswell, Alan Clark, actually as
Greville.
well. Sorry?
Greville.
I'm thinking about being close to power but not in power.
Yes, well, like Greville.
And also
indeed.
very interested in sex.
Oh, yes.
Which Greville isn't.
No, but he might have been if he'd been unexpurgated, who knows.
But do you think those two things, especially the proximity to power issue, is something that does help make a great diary?
I think being...
And Harold Nicholson, of course, you'd also...
Harold Nicholson as well. I think being close to power helps. I think not having too much of it helps as well. Although, I mean, you and I both knew Alan, he was a Minister of State for Defence and, you know, got to a reasonable senior rank outside the cabinet and took his job very seriously. And, I mean, he, to my mind, is almost unique, that's an appalling thing to say, in being quite powerful and writing a good diary. The ultimate example of somebody writing a massive diary, some bits of which I think are magnificent, others of which are very boring, and who had high office was Gladstone.
And Harold Macmillan was a diarist, of course,
yeah,
wasn't he?
Yeah, he was. Although, yes, the Macmillan diaries, I think, are better before he becomes Prime Minister than they are when he is. They're too self-exculpating.
Also, I suppose in the very modern world, do you even have time to write a diary if you're a modern-day Prime Minister? Are you looking forward to the Trust diaries, for example?
I suspect the Trust diaries will be nasty, brutish and short, as somebody might say. A bit like economic policy.
So where do you place Channon in the pantheon?
Do you know, it's difficult because I think Pepys is genuinely brilliant, and we're so indebted to Pepys because Pepys wrote in an age before television, before recorded sound. We're very reliant on Pepys for a description of post-Restoration London and everyday life there, and the unexpurgated Pepys, not the Bowdlerized Pepys, but the complete, sort of 11 or 12 volume Pepys, is absolutely brilliant. Chips is competing with all the newsreels of the time and endless journalism, many, many more books, contemporary books than were published when Pepys was writing. And so he's in a stiff competition to be taken as an ultimate describer of events and what goes on. But for all that, I still think he is.
Was he writing for posterity?
Not until, he didn't realise he was until 1937. He went to a Geordie at Oxford, at Christ Church, his college, and he was very secretive about keeping diaries.
Well, understandably so, considering what he's admitting to.
But I mean, he would occasionally write them late at night in the House of Commons, and people would come up and see him in the library writing it, and he'd close it and put it away and put a copy of a newspaper over it. And he didn't, when he says occasionally, oh gosh, XYZ saw me, and I think he thought I was writing a diary. And even Honor doesn't know he's writing a diary. But he's at this Geordie, and somebody says to him, gosh, you know lots of really famous people, don't you? Do you keep a diary? And Chips, who's had a drink too many, says, actually, I do. And this chap says to him, gosh, well, you know, given all the wonderful people you know, they must be absolutely brilliant diaries. And the next morning, he's clearing his hangover and walking around Oxford and putting himself together. And he thinks to himself, yeah, actually, I do know lots of really grand and famous people. And yeah, I think my diaries probably are quite good. And when I read that, I thought it was years since I'd read the Rose James edition. I bought it when I was at Cambridge, and I read it when I should have been reading something more important and improving. And I hadn't opened it since. And so I couldn't remember whether the tone changed or not. And I thought, well, my God, now he's said this, and now he said he's going to do it for posterity. They're going to change in tone and content, and they don't. In fact, they get, as I say, as he gets older, they get less inhibited, more candid, and he gets a bit more brutal. And I think that's, he gets to the stage that many people get to. I think they get the wrong side of 50. They don't give a stuff what anybody else thinks of them, and he's very much in that category, I think.
How did you decide what to leave out, apart from the incident that you failed to refer to?
Which I'm going to tell you about much later. It was quite straightforward. He gives endless lists of names of people he meets at parties. He gives complete table plans for his dinner and lunch parties. And hacking those out took out about 200,000 words.
Yeah.
When it came down to it, anything I thought was just boring, I took out. Anything which I left in everything of historical significance, and I left in everything that showed an important development in the character of himself and of the people with whom he was associating. So the regular stars rather than the guest stars. And of course, when he goes through important events, such as, or he's in the Commons at the Declaration of War in 1939, or various coronations or funerals, then all that's in there. Things like he's the only person I've ever read who gives a really clear account of, to go back to him, Lord Curzon's death and his funeral. Even a brilliant biographer like David Gilmour didn't have access to that and doesn't capture that. And so there are moments which any researcher of other aspects of 20th century history reading will say, gosh, this is useful, I haven't got this anywhere else.
Which makes this an important historical document.
Yes, which I suspected it would be, and which was the main reason I agreed to do it.
Yes. How long did it take you?
Well, thanks to lockdown, it took me 2.5 years. It would have taken me probably 5 years otherwise. It took me 1.5 years to do the first volume, and I did the last two in 12 months.
And it is the most extraordinary editing. Every single person who crops up in these diaries, of which there are thousands, is identified, and Simon gives you at the bottom of the page a potted biography of them and tells you their dates and so on. What did you find most difficult about the editing process?
Reading his handwriting. We had a very.
Did you write when drunk? Because that can often be a problem with diarists.
He wrote late at night, but no, it wasn't that. It was sometimes proper names are very difficult, and I usually got them because I had to cross-check various things. I usually knew them. When I was working, I had a blue folder with the manuscript there. On my split-screen computer, I had the version I was working on and the raw version that the estate had got a team of Oxford undergraduates to transcribe. And they were still transcribing when I started. And they were very bright young people, and I'm very grateful to them. But they didn't know, we didn't get quite to the stage where Lady Cunard became Lady Custard, but there were there were things almost as amusing as that. And so one had to check everything, and that was what slowed me down. But I found it, you and I have been around this course many times with many books. You know when you see something in an archive, that's effectively what I was doing, whether it's interesting or whether it's not, whether it's going to be of historical significance to other readers or it's not. And if anybody ever wants to publish the Chips Channon book of table plans, then it's there. They can go and ask the family and publish a book of his table plans, because that's largely what I left out.
Have you ever kept a diary?
When I was much younger. I haven't got time. I haven't had time for the last 30 or 40 years.
Yes.
Children, work,
Did you like him?
I think I would like him if I met him. He had some rather bizarre views. There's that wonderful moment in 1941 when Operation Barbarossa has been launched, and you may have seen this entry where he says, a masterstroke, Hitler's going to win the war now. And you just think, God, how wrong could you be? And he's repeatedly wrong about this, that, and the other. It's quite endearing. The gods will give us faults to make us men. I don't think I'd have wanted to spend my life with him in any sense. But I think if he turned up in the bar of one of our clubs, I'd buy him a drink and we'd have a long chat. It'd be interesting to talk to him. I'd love to hear, whether he thought I'd done a good job or not.
It's a different thing, isn't it? Editing diaries from editing from anything, pretty much anything else. I can see how, and I've reviewed the first 2 volumes of this, and I've loved this one as well. I can see how you might be charmed by your, especially if you're spending 2.5 years in the presence of your subject, how you might be charmed by him because you are the first person to be allowed into his mind, into his world, as it were. Do you think that might have happened to you a bit?
I hope not. I mean, I also had that similar experience with Enoch Powell, because I was the first person ever to read his papers. I was his official biographer. And you just have to force yourself into a position of objectivity. I mean, Chips was pretty harmless. You know, he said some nasty things about people. I think we all do that.
We don't say the kind of anti-Semitic remarks that...
No, but that wasn't what I was thinking of. I mean, you know, on a quotidian basis, he's really rude about people. There's a woman, I can't remember who it is, it's some very grande dame that he sees heavily bejeweled and says she looks like a ferret who's run loose in Cartier, which I thought was the most brilliant phrase. And, you know, he mints phrases like that. And you know, when the Rhodes James came out, I don't think that phrase was in there.
No, of course.
But there was enough in there to cause, was it Nancy Mitford, to say how dark Chips was, and Diana Cooper, who'd been a great friend of his for years, said, "Oh gosh, we never knew Chips was like that." I mean, heaven knows what these women would think if they read this edition.
And it's amazing they didn't. They claim not to have known that he was like that, but actually, I mean, isn't his writing, in a sense, a reflection of his conversation?
Yes.
I mean, if he hears a witticism, he's going to be writing it down in order to stick in his diaries, isn't he?
Yes, he is. How far he participated in the tone of that conversation, though, we don't know. We don't know how far he censored himself before writing things down. It may be that he just stood on the edge of conversations. He does report what 2 other people say to each other quite often. And so I think it's not so much exactly what he's doing. It's what, when he's at a lunch or a dinner or a cocktail party, what others are doing. And he was very keen for people to be interesting for that reason. It's why when he gets into his 50s and he's moved from being a political host to being a showbiz host, and he's got all Terence Rattigan's friends turning up for parties. And sometimes
who he is able to charm, even though they're very much outside his world.
They are.
The Bohemian world and the aristocratic world didn't overlap in the way that they did in the 1960s.
No, but I mean, there are people there he's got things in common with, like John Gielgud and Michael Redgrave, and you know, he gets very keen on them. But when they get boring, he just puts Benzodrine in their drinks, as I believe one does, and suddenly the whole room lights up.
Well,
and that's to make them sufficiently interesting, I think, so that he'll have a good time. Yeah. He can't bear being bored. He loves being on his own when he's exhausted. He says, "Oh, I had a wonderful day on my own, just doing nothing." But when he's recharged his batteries, he wants to be with people, because he feeds off them in that way. And I think the diary, certainly by the 40s, has become a big part of his life when he's no longer Rabs PPS. It's always how he justifies his existence to him.
Well, that was the next question I was going to ask. His diary, he starts off, doesn't he, as somebody who keeps a diary, and then morphs into somebody who the diary keeps.
Yeah.
And you can see him going to parties and dinners and things like this, not necessarily because he thinks he's going to have a wonderful time, but because he wants to write about it in the diary. And that's a fascinating psychological thing, isn't it, where it turns from your servant to your master, essentially.
Yes, and it's why his last years are so tragic, because as he has this breakdown in health and becomes more and more ill and less willing to go out, his diary obviously winds down, and the entries end nearly 18 months before he dies. It's as if he's given up. And I looked in the Times Index after the date of the last entry, and I think he goes to Parliament twice. Well, that's in the Hansard Index, and he puts this tragic notice in the Times in early 1958 saying Sir Henry Channon is no longer going to parties and going out, and he sends his friends apologies. And he spends the last 9 months basically lying in bed being very, very ill.
Tell us about the extraordinary story of the last section of the diaries being found.
The Rhodes James edition ends in 1952, and I always thought that was because that's when Chips gave up, because his life was already on a downward trajectory. But in 1990, a man knocked on the door of Kelvedon Hall and gave Paul Channon some carrier bags and said, "I think these belong to you." And they were the manuscripts of diaries from 52 to 57 that he just bought at a car boot sale. And the family to this day don't really know how they got to the car boot sale. They suspect, I think they're probably right, that some retainer had filched these from Kelvedon, because they were in an Essex car boot sale, filched them from Kelvedon when Chips died. I thought, well, one day these will make my fortune, and then, they didn't make that person's fortune. And I'm still hopeful that at least one missing period of the diaries will one day turn up.
21 to 22.
Yes, 1919 to 23.
Yeah.
Because they would be absolutely revelatory. That's when he meets everybody who subsequently becomes important in his life.
And why aren't they there?
I think either he destroyed them because they were so combustible in the metaphorical sense, or he's stashed them away somewhere and never really wanted to think of them again. And he had a lot of...
Have you turned Kelvedon upside down in the attic?
Searches have been made over the years. I didn't personally do it, but they may be in the muniment room of some grand family that he befriended, and that one day they'll come out and say, well, here we are, we've got them. The other thing I'd really love to have is the missing 6 months when Rattigan and Coates confront each other, when Coates comes back from India. And I suspect that there were diaries for that period, and I suspect Coates destroyed them because he found them so upsetting. But I don't know. That's pure supposition.
Wonderful. Right, so ladies and gentlemen, we've got plenty of time for questions. If we've got the roving mic, can we give the mic to that gentleman at the back there? I think it's the same gentleman who asked a very intelligent question in the last session. Yes, it is.
Yes,
not putting any pressure on you there, sir.
Sorry, what?
Not putting any pressure on
no,
you.
No. Yeah. I think what I wanted to ask was this. We've listened to... I haven't read the last lot, but we've listened to the first two, largely driving around the country for days and weeks. There is something about his... the way he treats with utter scorn, in particular scorn, social climbers, which we found very amusing, because he doesn't really feel he's arrived until he finally gets to that level of royalty where he finally feels people understand him. And I wonder, you may have answered this question about the 19 to 23 diaries. Is there anywhere where I haven't detected anywhere where he self-analyzes his rise without trace himself into the world that certainly wouldn't probably have recognized him from his, from where he came from? I mean, is this a psychological thing, do you think, or is it something he just doesn't refer to?
He never self-analyzes his social trajectory, but he does 3 or 4 times, mainly towards the end of Volume 1 and through Volume 2, sit down on his own sometimes and say, am I a truly abominable person? The answer, of course, is usually no, I'm not. I'm absolutely all right, but at least he asks it. He does take for granted where he's landed, and as you say, and it's a very good point, if we had those diaries of what we might call, and I use the word in its traditional sense, the transitional years, where he was transitioning from being an American to being a very anglicized American, then we might know the answer to that question. We might see him earning his spurs with Lord Curzon. Of course, the man who read the audiobook said to me, what did Chips sound like? Because there's no recording of his voice. And I asked 2 people who I knew who knew him, who were the Duke of Kent and Prince Michael of Kent, if they could remember how he sounded. And he's been dead for 64 years. Neither of them could. But then I met a man who was at Oxford with Paul, who's the eminent historian, Professor David Dilks. And he said, if you spoke to Chips, you thought he was he met him in the late 1950s, just before he died. He said he sounded like an absolutely pucker Englishman, except there was the occasional word where the vowels were wrong. Well, of course, Lord Curzon, famously because of his Derbyshire nanny, spoke with a short A. So when he went to the Western Front and saw soldiers bathing, he turned to his equerry or whatever it was and said, I never knew the working classes had such white skin. So,
and brass as well.
And brass.
Brass rather than brass.
He was very keen on brass rather than brass. So if Chips learned how to speak English from Lord Curzon as an Englishman, then that might explain something.
Next question. Gentleman in the front here, Scott Newman.
Hi. Simon, I'm just wondering what drove Mr. Channon was he sort of a serial operator, always trying to angle his way up? Particularly later in his life, was there a certain telos towards which he was striving? Or, yeah, later in his life, what drove him? Once he sort of accomplished the social status, once he established himself, what was there left to strive for?
He says something 2 or 3 times, and if only he'd met Andrew, he'd have worked out how to do it. He says it's grotesquely unfair that he's not in the House of Lords. And he says, why has God punished me in this way, that he hasn't put me in the House of Lords? And he wants it very much for dynastic reasons, because in those days all peerages were hereditary. And it's when Paul is born, and he sees Paul as the second Lord Kelvedon. Paul became Lord Kelvedon on his own merits. He didn't need his father to help him. And so that drives him. And yet when he gets, again, into his early 50s, he realises he's not going to get a peerage. He realises he might, if he's lucky, get a knighthood, and he does. But that he doesn't really worry about that. He's remarkably unimpressed by the knighthood that he gets.
Is there a real reason why, I mean, did he always vote with the government? Did he get a knighthood for being a good, solid, dependable backbench
Yes, he did.
MP?
He always voted with the government. And I think he found the 45 to 50 Parliament quite all right, because Labour had such a large majority, he didn't really have to involve Chips. But after 1950 and until 1955, when there was a very small majority for the Labour government for the first 18 months, and then a quite small majority for the Tories, he's always writing about how he's happy to do an all-night sitting and sit in the House of Commons until
And he's
5
doing it for
o'clock in the
Churchill,
morning.
who he despises.
He's
anyway.
doing it for Churchill, whom he despises. He also really hates James Stewart, the Chief Whip. And when he goes, Patrick Buchan-Hebburn, who takes over from him, is somebody he likes much more and has a relationship with, in the way he did with David Marcheston until 1940. And he likes to be a good boy to the Chief Whip. And he duly gets his knighthood for long service. He gets it when he's been MP for Southend for 21, 22 years. So, but as for what drives him on, I think the drive goes out of Chips's life after he realises he's never going to become a minister in 1941. And that's when he starts spending all his time at Claridge's and the Ritz, and even in wartime giving parties as far as he can get the food to give parties with.
And although all the reviewers have universally said that this is a wonderfully edited book, some of them say that he's a trivial figure. How do you respond to that?
I wouldn't dispute it. I think he is a trivial figure. I mean, no, he's not Mr. Gladstone. But just because he's a trivial figure doesn't mean he hasn't created a great historical document. Because although, of course, a diary is partly about him, his diaries are mainly about other people. And he presents them with its incredible clarity and revealing great powers of observation.
Yes, so they can be read as a sort of work of literature as much as history.
And he was, I say, he was very well read. He's always making allusions to literature and to classical literature. He was a great expert on painting. He's always comparing people to saying that they look like this portrait artist or that portrait artist. He particularly thinks a lot of people look like people painted by Sir Joshua Reynolds or by Hoppner when he meets a child. And so he's a man of some considerable intellect, but his main interest in life is going to parties. He calls himself the Lord of Hosts, which is actually rather a good joke. He was a very funny man. That's one thing that I think, as I say, England did to him. But he is trivial in that he writes a not bad history book called The Ludwigs of Bavaria, which is a history of the Bavarian royal house, which he writes in 1932 or 33 before he gets married. And that's it. He talks about he's written 2 novels, both of which got quite well reviewed. And he talks in the 40s about writing another novel, but he becomes really intellectually lazy. He doesn't, he is a creative person who can't find the energy to create, which must be pretty gruesome, actually.
Next question. Gentleman at the front.
In 1943, he has a judgment on Sir Anthony Eaton about the situation in Central Europe, the betrayal of Poland, Czechoslovakia, and seems to lay more blame on Eaton than Churchill. Do you think that's a fair assessment?
He's slightly irrational about Eaton. They were at Oxford together, and he's always been jealous of him. I mean, you know, when he met Eden at Oxford, they're the same age, almost exactly, born in the same year. But Eden had won the Military Cross and had a very distinguished war. Eden was also much cleverer than Chips. He was a brilliant linguist who could read Farsi and Persian. I mean, he was a really serious character. And of course, in Chips's view, he was the enemy because he had got cross with Chamberlain about the way that Chamberlain was handling foreign policy in early 1938 when he resigned. And Churchill was obviously in the wilderness at that stage, and so he didn't have a grudge against him for that. But I think he always thought Eden had, and the other glamour boys, as they were called, had had such a role in bringing down Chamberlain. And he was really genuinely very loyal to and fond of Chamberlain. I think with good reason, by the way. And he never, I think, forgave Eden for that. So I think a lot of the remarks he makes about Eden are deeply irrational and based on prejudice.
There's a question at the back there. The lady at the back. Can we give her a microphone to her?
Yes, I was very interested actually in the having, as my husband said, listened to these diaries while driving around the country and got his voice in our head. His parents-in-law's attitude, the breakup of his relationship with their daughter, they completely side with Chips. Now, how much was that just, do you think, the custom of the time? How naive were they about what he was up to? You know, it seems very strange that they basically give him loads of money and just completely side with him.
Yes, I mean, he was very lucky in his father-in-law. And, of course, he spends, once his marriage breaks up, and before he's divorced, he begins to worry about money. And not only has Lord Iver given him these 2 houses, but he's also given him a shed load of Guinness shares so that he can sit on the board of directors. And Chips is always whining about the size of the dividend because he wants more money. He's incredibly profligate with money. He talks in the 1939 diaries about, by Christmas, having spent £6,000 on jewels for Peter Coates. Now, you multiply that by about 60 or 65 to get today's figure. So he spent between £350,000 and £400,000 in 5 months on Coates, on jewellery, which was largely his father-in-law's money. I think that Lord Iver...
Did Coates have some money from the Coates Viella
No,
family?
he was of that family, but he was a bit like me and Heffer's bookshop. He was in the wrong... he was in the wrong branch.
Sorry, carry on.
No, but he lavished money on people, and I think his father-in-law was of that generation that expected men to behave badly in their marriages, but didn't expect women to. And he knew what Honor was up to because she told her sisters, and her sisters had told their mother, and their mother had told him. And I think that one thing that he and Chips had in common was when Honor ran off with the second-hand horse dealer from Ongar, if she'd run off with a dethroned king or a prince or even just an ordinary duke, Chips could have taken it quite well, and I think probably Lord Iver would have taken it quite well. But for her to run off with a horse coper was more than any of them could handle, and it just degraded her in their eyes. And Chips had been very discreet about his misbehaviour. If he went off to prostitutes in Shepherd Market, he put it in his diary. It didn't happen very often. And he certainly, to all intents and purposes, in that brief period before Coates went abroad that they were together a lot, did nothing that, well, he says he did nothing that, you know, Andrew and I might do together on a summer's afternoon, you know, go for a stroll and have a chat about life in general and have a drink. And so I don't think Lord Iver had any reason to suspect that Chips was doing bad things. Certainly if he kept his eyes open later in life, he would have noticed it. And you know, he was an indulgent father-in-law because his other son-in-law at that stage was Alan Lennox Boyd, whom we discussed earlier, and his love of the Navy. And his third son-in-law was the Crown Prince of Prussia, Prince Fritzi, who was on the wrong side, but actually came good. He was probably the most creditable of all Chips's of all Lord Ivor's 3 son-in-laws.
This is talking about the royalties. This is a good time to ask about his relationship with Prince Paul of Yugoslavia. What do you think that really consisted of?
Well, I think that's probably the main reason why the 1919 to 23 diaries are missing, or 22 diaries are missing. He met Prince Paul at Oxford. I think they were very, very close. I think rather than the way that Evelyn Waugh, who was up at Oxford about that time, admitted to a fling with a young man or two, I think probably that's where they had their fling. And I suspect the diaries...
ordeal of Gilbert Pinfold.
Yes, right. And I think probably those diaries went missing in order to protect Prince Paul more than anybody else. But he was devoted to him, and of course, Prince Paul's wife was the sister of his next-door neighbour, the Duchess of Kent. They lived in adjoining houses in Belgrave Square.
Who always comes out well from these diaries, Marina of Kent, doesn't she?
She does, and what's very interesting is a number of people who knew Princess Marina, who of course only died just over 50 years ago, say that she was in two minds about Chips quite a lot of the time, but was a very kind woman and treated him, because she knew how devoted he was to her husband, she treated him with great respect and friendship throughout his life. And indeed, you know, the present Duke is still a great friend of the Channon family, and they've always kept that very strong bond between them. And I think Princess Marina was a bit of a saint, but that also bound him into Prince Paul. And of course, in early 1941, when Hitler was getting very menacing towards Yugoslavia, Chips, with the government's permission, goes out to Belgrade and has a conversation with Prince Paul about, you know, what can happen. And he's very distressed when Prince Paul is deemed by the British authorities to have been on the wrong side, and is carted off to Kenya, I think, for an exile for the rest of the war. And this really upsets him. And indeed, I met a member of Prince Paul's family not long ago who said that what England did to him was the greatest blow of his life. And apparently Prince Paul, who was fundamentally a very decent man, would come to England in the 1960s, and he'd want to see people that he'd known for years, and he'd ring them up and saying, look, I'm coming to England, and if it won't embarrass you, would you like to come and meet me? Because he felt that he'd done something incredibly shameful. What you do, though, if a dictator is standing with a sort of pike staff over you and says, you know, I'm going to skewer you with this unless you do what I tell you, I don't know. I don't think there was an easy way out for Prince Paul or for Yugoslavia at that stage.
Another question. Gentleman at the front here. Canadian gentleman, just there.
Am I right that Harold Nicholson was another diarist who more or less overlapped with Chips Channon? And would you like to say anything about comparing the two? And did they get along? Did they know each other?
They did know each other. Not very well. Harold Nicholson was 11 years older than Chips. And I'm loath to make a comparison of their diaries because the Nicholson diaries have yet to be unexpurgated or de-expurgated, whatever the phrase is. And in fact, I was talking only on Friday to a member of the family, and they're still working out how to do it, and I think they will do it in the next few years.
Any chance of you editing them?
Not yet, no.
Okay.
I've got too much else on.
Yes.
But Harold Nicholson was a more consciously literary figure, of course, and a more establishment figure. You know, he was the official biographer of George V, and he had a slightly baroque private life, in a way that
Say that again.
in a way that Chips did, much of which is in Jim Lees-Milne's terrific biography of him. And it would be very interesting to read those diaries. So I'm not normally known for my reticence, but I think we're not comparing like with like. The published Harold Nicholson diaries are interesting, but you know, I'm not going to stay up all night reading them, which once or twice when I was editing Chips, I did stay up all night reading them, or more or less, because I couldn't stop reading them. And maybe that will be the case when the unexpurgated Nicholson comes out, and I very much hope the family will do it, and I very much look forward to reading them.
Just there. Gentleman there, yeah.
Was there ever any awareness publicly or within society about Chips's sexuality? And if so, why did he not become a pariah like other figures of the age, like the Earl of Beauchamp?
Well, Lord Beauchamp, of course, was the man about whom George V said, I thought fellows like that went outside and shot themselves. I think that was in the late 20s and early 30s. I think that by the time the war was over, attitudes had changed. Chips, as I say, never writes about this until 1939. And I think that's partly because if he is doing it, he's terrified that if his diaries fall into the wrong hands, he'll be locked up. The really sort of persecutional phase of homosexuals in England came under David Maxwell Fyfe, later Lord Kilmuir, who was Home Secretary in the Churchill government in the early 50s. And he told the police to go out and sort of clean out the lavatories of central London. And that's when Gielgud was arrested, and other police forces did the same thing. And it's why the Hampshire police arrested Lord Montague of Bewley and Peter Wildblood and others like that, all of whom were friends of Chips. And he writes about this extensively in Volume 3. And again, it's as if he's in a parallel universe. He writes about Lennox Boyd being very careless and says, oh my God, you know, his career's going to be over if he's not careful. And it's as if Chips himself isn't doing any of these things, or he's watching a man who looks very much like him do it on television, and sitting in the comfort of his armchair and does not think it won't come back onto him. Everybody in society knew what Chips did, particularly after his marriage broke up. And they knew he lived, you know, after the war, they knew he lived with Peter Coates. And the police didn't get interested, even in the Maxwell Fyfe years, unless you're doing it in a public place. And Chips did. He picked up a guardsman called Private Fur. That really was his name. And he picked up a guardsman called Private Fur. And Private Fur would come round and do what he had to do with Chips once in a while. And this Chips could easily have been arrested for doing that. He found him in a lavatory in Hyde Park. And I was speaking to a retired guards officer not long ago about this, who said it was his job as an adjutant of the guards in the early 60s to have these men up in front of him and, you know, not cashier them. They weren't chucked out of the regiment because they were quite valuable soldiers, but to put them on a charge and send them to the glass house for a bit. And he said, of course, we paid them so badly, that's how they made all their pin money. You know, they might not have liked it, but they always found these rich men, and it was a good way to make money. But I mean, as late as, what was it, 1958, when there was a Tory MP who was found in Hyde Park and had to resign as a minister, Ian, his name would come back to me.
Yeah.
I mean, it went on right through the 1950s, but providing you were discreet, it was fine. And, you know, to most of the world, Chips Channon didn't exist. It was just that coterie of people around him who knew.
There's the earlier one in the mid-1950s with the Conservative MP who was caught, and it was in midwinter in St James's Park, and Winston Churchill said to his private secretary, "Wasn't there frost on the ground that morning?" And the private secretary, Jock Culver, said, "Yes, there was, Prime Minister." And Churchill said, "Makes you proud to be British." We've got enough time for one more question. There we are. That.
Thank you.
Oh, Clemmy.
Hello.
Here we go.
So I know Chips once said something about kind of the memoirs of the frivolous always being very eagerly read. And I was wondering if you think that something in a kind of frivolous political diary is quite a kind of culturally anarchic thing to do, to kind of take it all very unseriously and make it sort of anti-establishment?
I can't see how anybody who was writing a diary today could be anything other than frivolous. I mean, partly because of the material, but also because, you know, one would lose the will to live if you had to read.
Do you read the modern ones? Did you read Sasha Swire's?
I thought Sasha's were terrific. I read Sasha Swire's diaries. In fact, I urged her before she published them to publish them, and I thought they were very good. And we did a couple of events together last year.
What else do you rate of modern diaries, i.e., contemporary diaries? Anybody else?
Well, not Alistair Campbell. I got all 6 volumes, and I started to read them, and they're still there. If I ever write a book on the Labour Party in the 2000s, which I don't want to do, they'll be a very valuable source. Alan Clark's diaries are brilliant. I absolutely love them, all of them. And again, I think there's probably some de-expurgation to be done there in the next 10 or 15 years. I think we won't be around to do it, but one of our sons might do it.
Right, well, ladies and gentlemen, the only thing that remains is for you all to go to the John Sandow bookshop over there, and before you do that, to thank Simon Heffer very much indeed. That was very, very good. Really, really good.